In this lesson, we're going to be talking about how to sculpt the egg of the rib cage. The rib cage, along with the head and pelvis, make up the three primary masses of the figure. If we understand how to create a simplified version of the rib cage, it can be a bony foundational structure that we can build the meat of the sculpture onto. We can add the anatomical details on top of this primary form. Let's first look at how the rib cage fits into our cranial unit system of measuring. When looking at the rib cage from the front view, we see that the rib cage will be 2 units from the top of the sternum to the 10th rib. Keep in mind that the false ribs will extend slightly below the 10th rib, and the rib cage will extend slightly above the sternum on the back side. From side to side, the rib cage will be just under 2 units at the widest point. If we look at the rib cage from the side view and measure its length along its longest axis, which is tilted back because of the curvature of the spine, it's about 2 1/3 units. The thickness of the rib cage from front to back is usually between 1 1/3 cranial units and 1 1/2 cranial units, or about 1 head unit. And remember, these general measurements might differ slightly from person to person. Also keep in mind that women typically have a smaller rib cage and wider pelvis, whereas men usually have a larger rib cage and a pelvis that is more narrow. This is often exaggerated to make the figure look more masculine or feminine. You might call it the Barbie doll effect or the G.I. Joe effect. When sculpting the egg of the rib cage on an armature, keep the egg of the rib cage thin. This means that we'll want to be inside those measurements of the average rib cage. This is important because once we finish the egg of the rib cage, we will then build out the contours on top of this primary form. If the rib cage starts out too thick, our sculpture will quickly become too bulky as we add on the secondary forms. The height, on the other hand, should be much closer to its final size. The widths are much easier to adjust than the heights. The rigid bony structures tend to be more symmetrical. The flesh and muscle will bend, twist, and stretch over the skeleton, so there is usually more variation and asymmetry in the fleshy parts of the body than there is in the skeleton. If the structure of the egg of the rib cage is not symmetrical, it will be extremely difficult to make things look right as you build the contours and secondary forms on top. So be sure that there's a clear center line to help you judge the symmetry, and then take your time to get it right. Now that we have an idea of the proportions of the rib cage, let's look at the shape of the rib cage. We're trying to get an egg shape with a few modifications to make it more rib cage shaped. To do this, we're going to observe the shape of the rib cage from the front view, from the side view, and from the top view. Let's start with the front view. I like to try to make a mental note of the widest point, which from the front view is about 2/3 of the way down. About right there. This helps me get the right egg shape that's wider towards the bottom. To start sculpting the rib cage, I like to start by adding a little bit of clay to the spine so that I can draw in a center line that helps keep things symmetrical. We can also draw some lines to indicate where the top of the rib cage will be, at about the level of the shoulders. We can also make a mark to indicate the length of the sternum, which will be about 1 unit. Then we can start to build out the egg shape starting from the front view. Remember that we're sculpting thin. I like to create a thin egg-shaped disc of clay from the front view. That way I only have to worry about one plane and one outline. Before we move on to the side view, we should indicate the angle that is made by the costal cartilage called the thoracic arch. It's this. Suck it in. Suck it in. Because this arch is made of cartilage, it will vary from person to person, but it tends to be wider in males and narrower in females. And there you have the front view. Next, let's work on the side view. Remember that when we're looking at the rib cage from the side view, the rib cage is tilted because of the curve of the spine. From the side view, it looks like a soft egg shape that has been squished to become slightly more angular. Imagine a soft egg being squished by a flat plane on top that's tilted forward, and by 2 side planes that press on the front and back. Let's build out the rib cage from the side view by placing clay on top of the center line. Pay close attention to the top plane of the rib cage. The plane where the neck extends from the rib cage is tilted forward. Let's make sure that we capture that tilt. The widest point is usually 1 1/2 cranial units from front to back. But because we're sculpting thin, we'll make it about 1 1/4 units. As I build out the outline from the side, I'm trying to add more clay to the front of the rib cage. This is because the front of the rib cage is farther from the spine. Also, the widest point on the side falls a little bit closer to the back of the rib cage than the front. We will be able to see this better when we're looking at the rib cage from above. From the top, it can be a little tricky. I like to think of that same squishy egg squeezed inside a trapezoid. The trapezoid causes the sides of the rib cage to angle slightly forward, which means that the widest point when looking at the rib cage from above is about 2/3 of the way back. This trapezoid shape is important to recognize. This is even more true on strong males that have big back muscles that increase this effect. Excuse me. If the primary forms of the body don't taper correctly, we may be able to see that something looks off, but it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly what's wrong. Okay, now we can add clay to fill out the rib cage all the way around. If we can build out a thin symmetrical egg with these adjustments in mind, it will be much closer to the actual shape of the average rib cage. Your assignment is to build out a few rib cages onto your armatures. If you haven't watched the lesson on how to build a wire armature for sculpture, you might want to go back and watch that lesson, do those assignments, build those armatures, and then you have something to build the rib cage onto. And if you have any questions on supplies, you can check out the video on sculpture supplies. In the premium course, we're going to go over how to sculpt the rib cage using planes to make a more geometric rib cage, because it's cool, because that's cool. There are also additional demos, additional lessons, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So go over and sign up for the full course. And if you have any questions, you can ask them below. Once we're done with the rib cage, we'll move on to the pelvis. See you in the next lesson.